Pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jimmy B. from Washington, Georgia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jimmy Bowman, and I'm an alcoholic. Now, I got to tell you now, if I'd have known there was going to be this many people here, I'd have worn my other shirt. We don't have as many people at my home group. This is just fascinating. I want to thank the committee and everyone involved for getting us out here. It has truly been wonderful. From the moment we stepped off the plane, we met Ann and Ken, and they have treated us like royalty, and I kind of like it. It feels pretty good. I'm coming back. We've met some characters out here. This has been a treat. It really has been a treat for a good old country boy from Wilkes County. Now, I don't mind telling you. This is fantastic. I remember when Debbie called me that night. She said, "I'm Debbie, of course, and I'm calling from California, the state convention. Would you come out and speak for us?" And I said, "Can I call you back?" Yeah. I wasn't ready. I wasn't quite ready. I was like my friend James, who lives in South Carolina now, but James grew up in the hills of North Carolina, which is moonshine country. And it was going to be James's first day of school. He was 6 years old, and he goes into the little schoolhouse. It was a one-room schoolhouse. And James, you know, the teacher, as she will, she'll go around and find out something about the new kids in school, and she gets around to James, and she says, "James, do you know your ABCs?" And James said, "Hell no, I ain't been here but 15 minutes. James got a whooping that day. And he said he got a whooping about every other day for the next 8 years, and he finally quit school in 8th grade because he thought they were going to beat him to death. But you see, James was ill prepared. He was not ready for school, just like I wasn't ready for that phone call Debbie made to me that night. You know, I said, "Let me get back to you. I'll have my people call your people, and maybe we can work something out." But I was amazed. It is indeed an honor to be here. It's an honor for me to be invited to do anything, anywhere in Alcoholics Anonymous. When that phone rings, regardless of what they ask me to do, where they ask me to do it, when they ask me to do it, I go. Because you see, Alcoholics Anonymous never said no to me. As many times as I came into AA bleeding and suffering, and they always said, "Jimmy, keep coming back." And I'll never forget what you people have done for me and my family. It's just been truly a great journey, a wonderful experience. And I've never met anyone in Alcoholics Anonymous that didn't help me. And I'm so grateful to all you people. Someone asked me one time, they said, "Jimmy, do you get nervous before you speak?" And actually, I don't really get nervous. I get a bit apprehensive. I think nervous is when you come to out in the backyard naked. And you're not real sure what you're doing out there. Now, fear is a whole nother deal. Now, fear to me is when you come to and realize you have drank your Sunday liquor on Saturday night. Now, that makes for some long, tough hours. You got to find out who you have offended the least. You got to find out which bootlegger you don't owe too much money to, because you got to find something to drink. But, you know, thank God and you people, I don't have to do that anymore. I am so grateful to you for that. I am sober tonight by the grace and care of a loving God, as He expressed Himself to me through you people. And I will be eternally grateful. Libby and I, like I say, we caught a plane and came out here. We had a wonderful trip. She doesn't mind going places with this no good, sorry drunk anymore. It's always a pleasure, you know, to have her come with me. And I'm so grateful that you all invited her as well, because she is such a part of my story. I live in a little small county. I realized early on that I was having a little problem with alcohol, and it was sometime around 1973. I live in a county that's about 9,000 people in the entire county. And 7,000 of those people thought I had a problem with alcohol. 2,000 of them were sure of it. Now, my wife was a member of that group. And I said, Leah, what you think I ought to do? She said, well, Jimmy, why don't you try AA or something like that? I said, well, I don't know anything about AA, but I'll give it a shot, you know. So I called a friend of mine that I knew had gone to AA years earlier. And I said, James, would you mind taking me to an AA meeting? He said, Jimmy, I'll be glad to, but we don't have a meeting in Washington anymore. They had closed that meeting up because they had cured all the drunks. But they had since started a meeting in Thompson, Georgia, and he said, I'll pick you up tomorrow night and take you to that meeting down there in Thompson. And we'll get started on this deal. And he said, now, let me tell you something. Don't drink anything. My wife and I are going to pick you up. I said, okay, I won't. So the next day now, I didn't drink but about 3 or 4 beers because I wanted to get the full benefit of that meeting that night. Well, James and Mabel, they came and picked me up and took me down to Thompson, Georgia, and we were getting out of the car to go into the meeting, and James stopped me out in the parking lot. He said, Jimmy, let me tell you something now before you go in there. I said, what's that? He said, before you go in there, he said, there's liable to be a fellow there tonight. He's going to run in the front door. He's going to hug all the girls, kiss all the women, pat 2 or 3 of them, and run out the back door. He's going to circle around the building, and he's going to do the same thing again. He's going to hug all the girls, kiss all the women, pat 2 or 3 of them, and run out the back door. But don't worry about him now because he's got brain damage. I said, okay, I won't worry about him. Well, he wasn't there that night. But I was to later on meet this man, and it was exactly the way James said it would be. He came in the front door, hugged all the girls, kissed all the women, patted 2 or 3 of them, and out the back door he goes, circles the building, comes back through and does it all over again. So I asked him to be my sponsor. I like the way he worked the room, if you know what I mean. You know, it tells us in our big book, if you want what we have, well, he had what I wanted. I heard a speaker one time said, you know, he went to his very first AA meeting and he said that was the only thing that he heard, if you want what we have. He said, I started going through their cars. They didn't have anything I wanted. But it's just great. Nobody told me that night, now write this date down, Jimmy, because it's going to be important one of these days. But I didn't write that date down. It was 1973, sometime like that. And I know I'm probably the only person in here tonight that's picked up more than 1 white chip. But I'm not really proud of that. It's just one of those things that happened. The second white chip, I believe, was the hardest chip I ever picked up in my life. By picking that chip up, I had to let you and God and everyone else in that room that night know that I had failed again, that I couldn't do what you had already done ahead of me. Now, getting up to about 5 or 6, they started getting a little bit easier to pick up. 10 and 12, you just kind of skip up there and get them, You get up about 19 or 20 now, they're going to quit clapping for you. They're going to say, there's Jimmy, he's drunk, And I didn't want it to be that way. That's just the way it happened to be. But I am so grateful. But that man that became my sponsor was a man named Jimmy Smith. And many of you probably have heard Jimmy Smith or heard of Jimmy Smith. He was right popular around our area, and he's come out here and spoken in California several times. But Jimmy was to be my sponsor until the day he died. Jimmy and I drank very similarly. He would go out and he would get drunk, and he'd come back into the AA meeting and pick up another white chip, and they'd say, Jimmy, keep coming back. We love you. And he'd go out and he'd get drunk. He'd come back to AA, and they'd say, Jimmy, keep coming back. We love you. And he'd go out and get drunk again, and finally he came in and they picked up another white chip, and they said, Jimmy, keep coming back. We need you. He said, now, wait a minute. I don't understand. He said, I understand all this love business, but what are you talking about when you say you need me? They said, well, Jimmy, we show you to the new people. And we tell them if they keep drinking, they're going to end up just like you. So everyone has a purpose in Alcoholics Anonymous now, let me tell you. But he was a super guy. Jimmy Smith was my sponsor. He was not my best friend. I think there's a big difference between friendship and sponsorship. I learned a long time ago, if you're looking for a best friend, go out to the pound and buy you a dog. But if you're looking for someone that'll turn your life around and tell you what you want to hear when you need to hear it, that's the person that needs to be your sponsor, whether you even like him or not. Because this is the person that's going to probably save your life. And Jimmy Smith was very instrumental in saving my life, and I loved him. I never did like him, but I loved him. My story is not unique. It's certainly not very pretty. Whoever the speaker was that you heard last time, if they spoke of suffering from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, they told my story. I believe our stories are so similar that it's just the way you tell it is the only difference that's involved. I did mine maybe in different places with different things and different people, but all our stories are basically the same, and we always end up in the same place. I'm going to skip back a couple of generations to my paternal grandfather, who was an Indian man. Now, I only bring that up for two reasons. One being I never met an Indian that drank whiskey that wasn't a drunk. And when he drank, he ran. And then along came my dad, a half-breed Indian man, and he drank whiskey, and he was a drunk. And when he drank, he ran. And then I came along, quarter-breed Indian kid, and I just didn't fit. I knew there was something different about me. I didn't know what it was. But I knew that when you looked at me, you saw that I was different, that I was not good enough. And I knew that I would never, ever be good enough. And I don't know why God, in all His wisdom, left that feeling out of me. But I knew there was something different. I was incomplete. I was to later on find out what was different about me. And I found out what God left out of me. He left alcohol out of me. Because when I drank, I became somebody. You know, I fit. It was that social lubricant that I had always looked for. And it was just great. I finally fit in some way, and it was wonderful. I am the alcoholic son of a drunken mother and a drunken father. Alcohol killed both these people. I have come to terms with that. It's a shame they didn't find this program that we hold so dear, but I've had to move on from that. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and my mother remarried and moved over to Greenwood, South Carolina, which isn't too far from my home now. And my brother and my sister and I moved in with her and her new husband. And here I was in a new city, not knowing a whole lot of people. And I think the first beer I ever had, or the first drink I ever had, was behind the old Ranch Drive-In. I think I was about 13 years old. And it was old gravel parking lot, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting out there with the guys, and they were all drinking and having a good time, leaning on the cars. And it was about half dark back then. Nobody could see us. And they finally said, "Jimmy, how about a beer?" I said, "Sure, I'll have one." Two things happened that night. One was I learned I detested the taste of beer. Why anyone would go to the effort to drink that stuff was just simply beyond me. I mean, it was God. I'd much rather have Coca-Cola. It was just awful. And so the second thing I learned that night was I'll never, ever drink again. That's it. You know, I don't need to fit that bad, you know. But about this time in my life also, I started talking to myself. I don't really recommend that, but I did it. But I'm talking to myself, and I continue to go out with these guys, and they continue to drink, and they continue to have a good time. And I'm talking to myself, I said, "Jimmy, you know what your problem was?" "No, what?" "Well, maybe you just didn't do it right." "Really?" "Yeah." "Why don't you try it again?" I said, "Well, I think I will." Now, the next time I did it exactly right. I drank just as much as I could possibly drink. I got just as sick as I could possibly get. I threw up just as much as I possibly could. I went into my first blackout, and I passed out for the first time from alcohol. Now, little did I know that from that night on, for the next 27 years, I was going to be a blackout drunk. I didn't know you could drink it any other way. And if you could, why would you? You know, I've seen people at parties that'll walk around and nurse a drink, you know, about half a night. You know, that's sick drinking to me. I couldn't do that. I drank out of a brown paper bag. You know, I threw it down there in that hole where it'd do some good, and I chased it with another one to make sure it stayed down there. That was my kind of drinking. I wasn't one of these party guys. About that time in Greenwood, I realized that Greenwood was growing tired of me. and that needed to be some changes made. And I figured it'd be in my best interest to get out of that place. I'd started getting into a little bit of trouble. So I called my grandparents and I asked them, could I move back over to Wilkes County, Georgia with them? And they said, yeah, Jimmy, we'd be glad to have you. And I moved back over to Wilkes County. Now, I hadn't been back in Wilkes County but a couple of days, but my problem with alcohol followed me back across the Savannah River. And here I was at this time. I wasn't but about 15 years old, and, I got this problem with alcohol. I don't even have a car, don't have any way to get one, don't have any way to go. So I had to find these older guys to ride around with. Now, a typical night for us, we'd be riding around, say, on a Friday night, and we'd run to the back of the beer joint, and find out which beer joint sell beer to us. And I'd run up to that back door, and he'd come to the back door. What you want, son? Give me a pint of wine. We're riding around out here. And he'd give me that pint of wine, and we'd go back in that car and be out there drinking and driving and having a good old time. And about 30 minutes later, I'm back at the back door of that honky-tonk, What you want this time, son? 6-pack this time. We're getting it on out here. So we're riding around and we're drinking that beer, and pretty soon I'm back at the back door of that honky-tonk again, And finally he opens the door and says, come on in, boy, you're worrying me to death. I can't keep running back and forth all night for you. That's when I was introduced to the honky-tonk, and I loved the honky-tonk. Lord have mercy. Oh, I loved everything about it. Everything about it. I liked old rusty records on the jukebox. I liked the old spilt beer everywhere, dust all over the place, cigarette butts on the floor. You got the old occasional drunk, he's laying over there on the floor. He can't get up and he can't stay there, But he's got purpose. And that's what I want to be. I want to be someone with purpose. So I'm striving to be this drunk here for the next several years. But anyway, I went on to graduate from high school there in Washington without honors, by the way. And I had to make this decision about where I was going to go to school, so I decided on a little college down in Cochran, Georgia, called Middle Georgia College. Real small school. And I remember talking to the dean that day, very nice man, Dean Stokes. I don't know why I remember his name, I just do. He said, Jimmy, we're glad to have you down here at Middle Georgia. I said, yes, I'm glad to be here. He said, Jimmy, now for you to stay at Middle Georgia, a certain amount of studying is going to have to be taking place. I said, yes, I realize that. And under my breath, I'm saying in order for me to stay in Cochran, Georgia, a certain amount of drinking is going to be taking place. Well, you folks be happy to know all these folks in Georgia are not real slow like I am. It didn't take them but 2 quarters to figure me out at college. And they decided if I was going to continue my education, it'd be at somewhere else because I wasn't welcome in Cochran anymore. So I moved back home and I got me a job in a little old mill there. I was doing something exotic like pressing raincoats or, something. I'm going to get rich pressing raincoats for a living and make my millions and do that. And but here again, I'm still talking to myself. I've always got this ace in the hole, you see. And I'm talking to myself and say, Jimmy, you know what your problem was? No, what? You went to the wrong school. Really? Yeah, that's what you did. You went to the wrong school. Why don't you try again? I said, well, I think I will. So I enrolled a little bit closer to my home there in Augusta, Georgia, at Augusta College. And I remember talking to that dean that day, very nice fellow. He said, Jimmy, I understand you had your problems in Cochran. I said, yes, I did. He said, now, Jimmy, for you to stay in Augusta College now, a certain amount of studying is going to have to be taking place. I said, yes, I realize that. And I'm saying under my breath, in order for me to ride back and forth to Augusta every day, a certain amount of drinking is going to be taking place. Now, this will make you folks happy. The closer I got to home, the smarter people started to get. It didn't take them but 1 quarter to figure me out at Augusta College. And here I am, I'm kicked out of my second school, So I get me a job in another little old mill there. I think I'm puttying nail holes in mobile homes, mobile home trailers, I can work myself up to God knows what other job from here, And but anyway, by this time I had discovered what was my favorite watering hole. It was a place called Wayne Waller's Beer Joint. And it was your classic beer joint. It was an old clapboard siding place, tin roof, had old rusty Budweiser and blue ribbon signs all over the thing, old broken neon lights. axe handle on the wall that said "No fighting" burned into it, And I love that. You could feed chickens through the floor of that beer joint. I mean, it was just great. I was out there one night talking about that no fighting, and a fight broke out. Two old drunks, they started to fight. Wayne's heating arrangement and seating arrangement, he had a pot-belly stove right out in the middle of the honky-tonk, And he had some old bus seats. And when it got cold, he'd fire up the stove, and all the folks would sit around the bus seats. Two old drunks get in the fight, and they knocked that pot-belly stove over. And soot's flying all over the place, and these two old drunks just wailing away, and I'm sitting up there on the cold mug cooler about to die. There's not a place in the world I would rather be in than right there in that beer joint that night. I just love that place, and I love those fights. When the fights break out, I was having a good time. I didn't necessarily like being in the fight. I like watching the fight. I learned a long time ago that a good run is better than a bad stand any day. But I was out at Wayne Waller's beer joint one afternoon, and I'm sort of like my sponsor. Jimmy Smith's sponsor was a man named Tommy McNeil. We buried Tommy with 17 years sobriety. And Tommy and I drank very similarly. When we drank, we broke out in spots. Now, some of the spots I broke out in Canada on 3 different occasions. I broke out in Mexico 3 different times. I've broken out in several of the Midwestern states. I've broken out in every state in the South, from Georgia to California. The furthest breakout I believe I ever had, I broke out one time in Sydney, Australia. And this deal, it started innocently enough. I'm sitting up at Wayne Waller's beer joint, minding my own business, having a beer after work. And a friend comes in. I hadn't seen him in several years, and he come over, and we're talking, and he says, "Jimmy, you've been to Canada a couple of times, hadn't you?" I said, "Yeah, I have." He said, "Did you like it?" I said, "Yeah, I did." He said, "Have you ever been to Australia?" I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Would you like to go?" I said, "Yes, I would." That's all it takes. Folks ask me all the time, say, "Jimmy, how in the world, well, you sit on a bar stool long enough at Wayne Waller's beer joint, you going places. You going somewhere." Well, about 6 weeks later, we left. He bought this old beat-up Mercedes, and we drove across the southern United States, and of course I got drunk in every one of them. And we ended up just up the coast here at a little town just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco called Sausalito, California. And he took that Mercedes and sold it, and we rented a car because we were waiting on that ship to come in a few days. And I was driving that rental car. It was either late one night or early one morning. I never could too much tell the difference. But I was riding right down Main Street there in Sausalito. And what happened was I wrecked that rental car. I could not believe it. What happened was I ran over a parked car. Now, we are sensitive people. The last thing that we want to do is get someone in trouble. My thinking at that time was that man should have known. Had he left that car parked there long enough, someone was going to hit it. Now, I am the unfortunate person that came along and hit the car. I do not want to get him in trouble. So I left. I don't know what he told those rental car people when he took that car back. But anyhow, he managed to get us on the boat. And our first stop was going to be Vancouver, British Columbia. And we got to Vancouver late in the afternoons. It was right pretty up through that part of the country. And we got off the boat, and we're walking down the streets in Vancouver. And I'm looking around, and I look up on this big marquee, you know, and marquee is a big word for me. There's not any marquees in Wilkes County, Georgia. But there's this big marquee, and it says, the fifth dimension. You know, so I don't know if it's another plane of existence or a rock group or whatever it is. But I walk into this nightclub, and sure enough, there it is. It's the fifth dimension, the rock group, you know. And there's Marilyn McCoo, and she's up there, and it's the age of Aquarius. And she's up there dancing and singing, and I'm up there singing and dancing at the bar, and I'm just having a grand old time, you know, and looking around. And I look over in the corner there, and I could not believe my eyes. There in the corner sat Andy Williams, old Moon River himself. You know how it is when you're drinking. Sometimes you just know things. Y'all know what I'm talking about. You just know things. Well, see, I knew that Andy wanted to meet me. I mean, you think about it now. When would he ever have another chance? So I'm over there talking to Andy, and we're drinking, or I'm drinking. I don't know what Andy was doing, and I'm having a good old time. Anyway, one of us got thrown out that night. And I'm 99% sure it wasn't Andy. The next thing I remember, I wake up, I'm out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somewhere on a boat headed to Hawaii. So we pull into Honolulu, Hawaii some days later, and we get off the boat and we go to the rental car place and rent a car so we can drive around. Of course, we go to the liquor store right after that, and we're there in Honolulu for 24 hours riding around drinking liquor. That's all I saw of Honolulu. Anyway, he manages to get us back on the boat, and geographically here, I'm not real sure which it was. I think it was the Fiji Islands was our next stop. Very primitive place, if I remember correctly. A lot of thatched roof huts and what have you. But most of my time that I spent looking at the bar floor in the Fiji Islands. And he manages to get us back to the boat again. And our next stop was Auckland, New Zealand. Very pretty place, Auckland. It's a lot of stonework and greenery and all. And I really like it. The only reason I know anything at all about Auckland, we got there early in the morning, and no bars are open in Auckland in the morning. And so I did get to see a little bit of that country, but when the bars opened, of course, I got drunk, and he got us back on the boat. Our next stop was Sydney, Australia. And I remember pulling into Sydney Harbour. And that's when I took, I think, my very first inventory. Very much like our fourth-step inventory in Alcoholics Anonymous. I pulled out my wallet, and I looked at all the sadness that was there. And I realized, here I am. I'm about 12,000 miles away from home. I'm going to a country that I don't know a living soul. I'm riding on a one-way ticket. I don't have a job. I'm uneducated. I'm sick with the flu. And I got $9 in my pocket. So I talked to this cab driver, and he was kind enough to relieve me about half of my money and took us to a place to stay, for the night. And we stayed there for about 24 hours. And I was sick with something. I don't know what it was. But here again, I'm still talking to myself. Jimmy, what are you going to do? Well, you got to get a job, fool. You can't stay out here for nothing. Well, where does a good drinking drunk go to get a job? There you go. That's right. That's the only place I know to go, So I'm at the bar. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. I had long since been introduced to the morning drink, and I'm sitting there talking to that bartender. And pretty soon I see a guy kind of ease up a little bit close to me over here on this side of me, and I'm trying to look at him peripherally, and I'm talking to the bartender still, and finally another guy, he slides up here on this side, and he's looking at me kind of funny. And finally one of them said, "Boy, where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from Georgia." And God, they just howled, They never had heard anybody talk regular like we talk. So I'm sitting there talking to these two guys and to the bartender, and finally one of them says, well, Jimmy, how about a beer? I said, well, one, be nice. So they start buying me beer, and I'm having a good time, and I'm talking to all these guys, and they'll get me something to eat if I need it. And pretty soon, I've talked about everybody in that place, and one of them grabbed me and said, look, there's this place across town. You need to go in and talk to those people too. I said, let's go. To make a long story short, that $9 lasted me 6 weeks in Sydney, Australia. Now, the way I did that, I'm not very proud of. I'll be right up front about that. You see, by that time in my life, I had learned what's commonly known as the con game. And everybody in here had one. Don't act like you didn't. Come on, let's face it. Mine, it went something like this. I'll give you a quick refresher course. If you had it, and I wanted it, or needed it, then I had it. It was as simple as that. Now, a lot of times, I'd have it, and you didn't know I had it. The only thing you'd know for sure was you didn't have it. And if somewhere along the way I slipped up and you found out that I did have it, give me about 5 minutes to talk with you, and you'd be kind of glad I had it. That's the way it worked. I'm not proud of that. But we'd rent a little old flat out on Bondi Beach, which is just out of Sydney there. And I remember it was August, which is wintertime over there. And my diet in those last few days in Sydney consisted of one order of fish and chips and a bottle of the cheapest wine that I could find. And I remember it was one morning, I'm sitting out there looking at that gray ocean, just me and my bottle of wine, having that conversation with myself. Jimmy, when are you going to do something with yourself? When are you going to become somebody? More was meant in life for you than this. Why don't you do something with yourself? If I could just get home, everything will be okay. That's where they love me. That's where they care about me. If I can just get home, I'll be all right. So I made that phone call, and sure enough, they wired me the money. Now, where they got the money from, I don't know, because these were not well-to-do people. But they wired me the money to come home, and I caught a flight out of Sydney into Honolulu, and then from Honolulu to San Francisco, and then an early bird flight from San Francisco into Atlanta. We arrived at the airport in Atlanta, and I called a friend of mine that I knew there, and he came and picked me up, took me to the liquor store, and then took me to the bus station. And here I am sitting on a bus headed back toward Wilkes County, Georgia. Now, as fate would have it, that bus was riding right by Wayne Waller's beer joint. Now, I asked that bus driver, he didn't mind. I sure would appreciate him letting me off at that beer joint. He said, yes, I'll be glad to. You see, that bus driver had grown tired of me by then. And it was about lunchtime, and I remember Wayne was closing for lunch, and he saw me get off the bus with my bag and walk across that gravel lot, and he opened back up. And I'm sitting there having a couple of cold beers with Wayne, and I always put a lot of stock in what Wayne Waller said. He was a smart fellow, a lot smarter than I am. He owned a beer joint. But I'm sitting there talking to Wayne. He said, Jimmy, you've been gone a long time, hadn't you, son? I said, yes, I have. He said, a long way, too. I said, yes, sir. He said, Jimmy, why don't you slow down? Why don't you settle down and do something with yourself? You do all this running around and craziness. Why don't you settle down? I said, Wayne, you know what? It is ironic that you would say that. Because I have been thinking exactly the same thing. What I'm going to do, I'm going to trade that old car I had. It's not good enough for me, and I'm going to get me a nicer car, and I'm going to get me a little house, a fixer-upper or something like that, or apartment, and get me a nice job. I want a job that pays a lot of money, and that's what I want. And I might even get married, for God's sakes. He said, Jimmy, why don't you do that? I said, you know what? I think I will. So I walked over, and I picked up the phone, and I called my wife-to-be, and she came and picked me up. And on January the 10th, in 1969, we were married. I got married on my birthday, so I wouldn't forget it. And I'm married to the same woman today. And that's God's doing now, not mine. I'm going to tell you a little bit of something about this lady that travels with me from time to time. All this little girl did was clothe, educate, nurture, care for, was Boy Scouts for, Girl Scouts for, was Santa Claus for, was everything for. 3 beautiful kids, wonderful kids. And I wanted desperately to be a part of that family. But alcohol took that away. Every night that I go to bed now, I thank God for that lady. And every night that I go to bed, I say, I can't love her this much tomorrow. And when I wake up the next morning, I love her more. She is my reason for being. She is everything that I hold dear. And I am so grateful that the God of my understanding put her in my life. Sweetheart, I love you. Within a year of our marriage, our first child was born, a little boy. And he was the apple of his daddy's eye. You know, I remember that conversation. I said, Jimmy, this little boy's going to need a father at home. He's going to need a dad around, unlike the father that you had. He's going to need a dad that'll teach him how to throw the ball and dance with the girls and be nice to the other children. He's going to need a father. And you're going to have to be that for him. And with every ounce of my being, I was going to be a dad for this little boy. But my drinking progressed and escalated. 3 years later, our second child was born, a little girl. And I fell in love with this child instantly. And I had that same conversation. Jimmy, your family is complete now. You've got that little girl. She's going to need the piano lessons and the ballet lessons and the pretty dresses like all the nice little girls have. And you're going to have to be around for this little girl because from time to time, she's going to need her father's shoulder to cry on when her mother's simply won't do. You're going to have to be there for this child. With everything I considered holy, I was going to be there for that little girl. But my drinking progressed and escalated. We have another little girl. I'll tell you about her in just a little bit. The year was sometime around 1974 or 1975. I'm not even sure of the year. But I remember that the way that I was drinking, I couldn't stand it much more living on this earth. At this time, I'd been on about a 4-day drunk. And I remember in the bedroom that night, lying in that bed and making that decision. I remember getting up out of the bed that night, walking into the kitchen, reaching on top of the refrigerator and grabbing the gun. I remember a wife and 2 small children sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor that night crying and begging their daddy not to do it. I remember going out of the house that night and getting into the truck, and I remember the sound of the gun. I remember it not being quite as loud as I thought it would be. And the strangest sensation of absolutely no pain, none whatsoever. And then I remember a very intense heat, as though my body were on fire. And that was followed very rapidly by the massive nausea, and then the rush of vomit and blood. I remember the sound of the ambulance coming through town that night. It was a quiet night in Washington. The last thing I remember was when they were wheeling me into the emergency room there at the hospital was my wife's aunt was there. And the last thing I said was begging her to tell them not to cut me. That's the last thing I remember. I came to a day or so later in intensive care there in Washington. And of course my wife was there. And she said, Jimmy, do you remember anything? I said, Sugar, I remember what I did, and I'm so sorry to put you all through that. She said, I'm not talking about that. Do you remember anything while you were out? No, I don't. Should I? She said, when they got you on the operating room table, they could find no pulse. They could find no blood pressure. And you had a hemoglobin count of 4. And you died on that operating room table. Now, nothing tonight would please me more to tell you wonderful people here in Southern California about an afterlife experience. But I simply can't do that because, to the best of my knowledge, I didn't have one. And the only thing that I can attribute that to today is simply this, is that the God of my understanding simply was not ready for me yet. And that there was work left for me to do. I stayed in the hospital for 28 days. And the day that I got out of the hospital, I got drunk. You see, alcohol was not my problem. Alcohol was my solution. Alcohol made everything fit. I was to stay drunk for 13 more years. The last 4 years of my drinking, probably the most important. A typical day for me went something like this. I'd crawl into that porcelain altar in the morning and I'd beg your God not to let me get drunk that day. Somehow I'd manage to get to work. And I could usually now make it until about 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and then reality would start creeping in. And I don't do reality. Not at all. And I'd be out under the front seat of that pickup truck drinking that cheap 80 proof Gilbey's vodka. And that usually lasts me until about lunch. And I'd take me 2 or 3 good pulls on that stuff on the way to lunch and 2 or 3 honks of it on the way back from lunch. And that usually lasts me until about 4 o'clock. Now, being a successful businessman, as I was at this particular time, I had these jobs I got to go check on. You know how we are. Well, I got to leave. Y'all lock it up when you come back, you know. And I'd head just as straight to Billy D's liquor store as that truck would take me, and I'd get me another liter of that 80 proof vodka. At the time, I lived about 2 miles from my office, and it took me 45 minutes to get home every afternoon. You see, I'd hit those backcountry roads drinking that vodka. I have solved every problem the world will ever have in the front seat of that pickup drinking that vodka. I'd be riding those country roads and I'd turn the tunes on, and I'm driving probably a little too fast, and the tunes would come on. It'd be the Pointer Sisters, and they're so excited. And I am too. And I'm driving and I'm singing. And then Jackie Wilson comes on, this Lonely Teardrops. And oh, God, I'm losing it now. You know. Anyway, I'd get to the house and I'd pull in the back door. And if there wasn't a fight going on, I'd start one. Somebody had to go. Preferably it'd be them. You see, when they left, I could go out and get the vodka from under the front seat of the truck, and I could put it under the bed and drink in peace. Now, blackout time for me was about 7 o'clock. Pass out time was 9 o'clock, and I'd pass out. I'd come to the next morning, crawl into that porcelain altar, and I'd beg your God not to let me get drunk that day. Now, this went on day after day, month after month, year after year, till I knew that my life on this earth was not going to be much longer. I was at my office one afternoon, and a very dear friend of mine came to see me. She said, Jimmy, come go to ride with me for a few minutes. I want to talk to you. You see, when I'd get home in the afternoons and I'd start these fights, my wife and daughter would leave, and my wife would go to Al-Anon, and my daughter would go to Alateen. Now, if it were not for the Al-Anon family group and the program of Alateen, you people would have a different speaker here tonight. You see, I had long since given up on Alcoholics Anonymous. But she drove me around that afternoon. Now, this lady was my daughter's Alateen counselor. And she said, Jimmy, I've got a problem with your daughter, Lene, and maybe you can help me with it. I said, well, Kathy, I'll do anything I can. What can I do? She said, well, I went to your daughter, Jimmy, and I asked her, I said, Lene, is there anything I can do to help you? And my daughter's reply was simply this. She said, Miss Kathy, I don't know of anything you can do to help me unless you can tell me what I can do to help my daddy. I have never had anything hurt me as much as that statement hurt me that afternoon. I've never had anything hurt me since as much as that statement hurt me. Because you see, that moment I realized that I had always told myself the greatest alcoholic lie that there is. I'm only hurting myself. And I'll stand here tonight in Garden Grove and tell you people, and I believe this with all my heart, it is my God-given right to drink myself to death any time that I want to. But the right was not given me to take others with me. And that's what I had begun to do. Mercifully, she let me out of that van that afternoon, and I didn't even go back in the office. I went straight to the liquor store and I got drunk. That's the way I dealt with pain. The next afternoon, I intentionally went home early, and my wife was there cooking supper. And I said, Lib, Kathy came to see me yesterday, and she mentioned a treatment center in Augusta, Georgia. What do you think? My wife said, hold that thought. And she left. I knew she's going to be gone a while. She cut the pots and the pans off, and I watched her get out of sight. So I run out to the truck, and I get the vodka, and I put it under the bed. Blackout time rolls around, they're not back. Pass out time rolls around, they're still not back. So I go on and pass out. I hadn't been passed out too long, and my son comes into the room. He's a big strapping young boy by this time. He said, Dad, come go along with me. Where we going, boy? Well, we're going over to Grandma's house. I want to talk to you for a few minutes. Should I take my truck? He said, no, you can ride with me, Dad. So here we go to Grandma's house. I walk in the back door, and you have never seen the beat of it in all your days. There sat my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, my wife, my son, my oldest daughter, and that dang Alateen counselor. And the whole crowd was crying. I mean, something miserable must have happened. And so I didn't know what to do. So I cried with them. But what these folks were doing, you see, they were having a tribunal on me. And the things they had to say about this old boy wasn't very nice. But, you know, they let me know right up front, said, Jimmy, you can say anything you want to say after we get through saying what we got to say. They got through saying what they had to say, and there wasn't anything I wanted to say. I never did like talking with folks that knew more about me than I knew about me. And they seemed to know a lot more about me. I was given two choices that night. I could go to that treatment center that night, or I could go the next morning. I looked around the room, and my son, he seemed to be the most rational person there at that particular time. I said, what do you think, son? He said, I think in the morning it'll be fine, Dad. God, was I glad to hear that. I had just bought a brand new liter of vodka, and I knew if I left it sitting around, somebody going to find it and drink it. So I told my wife, look, I got to run down to the office, straighten out a few things, and do this, that, and the other. She knew what I was going to do. And I went down to the office that night, and I drank half a liter of vodka. Got up the next morning and drank another half, the second half of that liter, and finished it off. And off to the treatment center we go. That was on April 13th, 1988. 15 years after I had been to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll be honest with you about this. I did not go to that treatment center to get sober. I went there for one reason and one reason only, and that was to let my family know that when I got out of that treatment center and I killed myself and or others, that maybe they could rest in peace knowing that they had done all that they could do. But something happened in that treatment center, and to this day I don't know what it was unless it was the hand of God working through those people. And I came out and I wanted to be sober. And I went mainline AA. At that particular time, there were, I think, 2 meetings a week in Washington. That was not nearly enough for me, so we had to go to meetings out of town and going all over, just different cities, going to meetings and having a good old time. And so I'm rocking along in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm about 18 months dry in AA. And that's when the depression hit. And it was a depression I couldn't shake. I don't know what brought it on. No particular event had happened in my life for me to be as depressed as I was. But I remember it was not the type of depression where you want to do harm to yourself. It's the type of depression where you simply want to sit down and die. And I couldn't shake it. I tried going to different meetings, talking to different people. Nothing seemed to work. At long last, I went to the very best friend I'll ever have on this earth, and that's the woman I wake up with every morning. And I said, Lib, something's wrong with me. I'm so depressed and I don't know what to do about it. And I'm so afraid that I might drink again. She said, Jimmy, I've noticed something's wrong with you, but I can't help you. You're going to have to find the answer inside you. At that moment, I said the very first sincere prayer that I had ever said in my life. And it was something like this. I said, God, if there is a God, please don't desert me now. Within a couple of weeks, that depression was gone. It left just as silently as it had come. A few weeks or a few days after that, I was on my way back from an AA meeting in Augusta. It was a late afternoon meeting. And I was on the Interstate 20, somewhere between the Harlem, Georgia, and the Thompson, Georgia exit on Interstate 20. And that's when the presence came to me. It's not the type of presence that you read about in the big book. There was no bright light. There was no physical apparition whatsoever. There's no music, no song. But it was a presence that seemed to flow right through me. And I knew at that moment that everything that was good and everything that was pure and everything that was wonderful in this world and in the next one was in that truck with me. And I knew had that truck rolled over and blown me into a million pieces, that everything was going to be okay. But more importantly than that, I knew that from that very moment on, I would never, ever have to be alone anymore. And I was at peace. And that's the way the God of my understanding came to me, by practicing the principles that you people so freely gave me in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I am so grateful for that. When I got about 2 years sober, I had one of the best jobs a recovering drunk can ever have. That Alateen lady ran a little treatment center in Washington there, a little outreach program, and she asked me if I wouldn't mind coming over and talking to the new people that came in off the streets, you know. And I love that job. I love talking to the newcomers. I decided I was going to keep that job until one of them told me the truth. Now, it says in the big book, you can read it and find it, sometimes they will even tell you the truth. That wasn't the case with me. But anyway, I love working with newcomers. And nobody tells the story of the newcomer better than Ray V. Ray was chairing a newcomers meeting out in Texas. And they always had the newcomers meeting at 7 o'clock so they could get all the BS out of the way and have the regular meeting at 8 o'clock. And there were, 7 or 8 young guys sitting around the table there that night. And Ray said, would you like to share anything? And he said, yes, sir. I used to drink shoe polish. The next guy says, shucks. I used to drink kerosene. Lit. The next guy said, wait a minute, you don't understand. He said, I blacked out one night in Nashville and came to the next morning in Memphis, Tennessee. Next guy said, so what? I blacked out one night in Hong Kong. Came to 3 days later in Montreal, Canada. In my car. The next guy said, well, wait a minute, you don't understand. I've been married 4 times. Next fellow says, shucks, I've been married 3 times since lunch. Twice to my sister. You cannot outdo these people. Forget it. Just listen and love them, you know. But that's one thing that keeps me coming back to AA is the laughter. But along with the laughter, we must share the pain. Now, the story I'm going to tell you now is true. The man had been on about a 4-day drunk, and he managed to get home that night and get upstairs and go to bed. He came to the next morning and runs down the steps, goes through and gets into the garage, gets in his car to go to work. He's backing his car out of the garage, and his wife realizes that he had forgotten his lunch. And she runs out on the front porch stoop to catch her husband. And then arriving on that front porch stoop, she faints. The man, not realizing what had happened to his wife, stops the car and immediately runs out to check on her. And in passing the front of his car, he finds the body of an 8-year-old little girl embedded in the grill of his car. But for the grace of God, that could have been me. But for the grace of God, that could have been you. Someone asked me to go back and research what happened to that couple, and I did. The man, of course, went to prison. His wife went insane. The family disease of alcoholism. My son always says to thank you people in Alcoholics Anonymous for what you have done for him and his family. He graduated from high school and went off and was playing college ball and college football, and he had a game up in Memphis, and he invited his mom and I to come up, see the game, and spend the weekend with him. Of course, we did. We got to the field early that day. And I remember sitting up in the stands, and it was, you know, they hadn't even begun the warm-ups yet. And my son sees me sitting up there, and he waves me down to the sidelines. And I'm sitting there on the bench, and I'm talking to my son, you know, before the game. And a couple of his closest friends on the team, they come walking by. He says, you guys come here a minute. I want you to meet my dad. This is the same little boy that sat on that kitchen floor that night crying and begging his daddy not to do it. But because of you people in Alcoholics Anonymous, that little boy is not ashamed of his daddy anymore. I can't pay you back for that. My oldest daughter says always to thank you people in AA for what you have done for her. She was a very brilliant child. She studied one summer at Corpus Christi College at Oxford University in England. She studied economics and international finance, whatever the heck that is. But she says to thank you people in AA for what you have done. You see, she was not the type of child to leave her mother home alone with a drunken father. And everything she has today, she knows she owes to you people. She gave us 2 of our 3 grandsons. And what a joy they are. My youngest daughter, I'll tell you about her now. She was at a band concert there in our little gymnasium there in Washington. It was to be her last band concert. She was sitting out there on the floor that night with a new skirt and shoes and plays the flute. And she was having a grand time. And they played this little warm-up song that they always play before the band starts, you know. And I remember a tear coming to my eye that night. Because, you see, at my way work, that child never would have been born. She was born 2 years after that night in 1975 that I had decided life simply was not worth living anymore. And had my way worked, the world would have missed that little bit of laughter. She went on and graduated from high school, valedictorian of her class. Went off to college and graduated in 4 years, and now she is married and gave us our other grandson. She always says to thank you people in AA for giving her daddy back. There are going to be people that come into your respective home groups that are going to be just as sick, if not sicker, than I was. Please be patient with these people. I have found that I never know what disguise God is going to use when He sends the person to Alcoholics Anonymous to look after my children when they get here. Any newcomer that I let walk out of the door and not try to help may be the person that God sent to help your child. Please love these people. Please be patient with these people. I've sat around Alcoholics Anonymous long enough to know that I've never seen anyone come in here because everything is going so well for them out there that they're looking for a place to hide. They came in for the very reason that you and I did. They had nowhere else to go. We've got to be home for these people. Again, I'd like to thank you ever so much for having me and Liam out. It has truly been an honor. If you're ever in Wilkes County, Georgia, I hope you'll stop in and see us. Maybe not all at once. But this has truly been terrific for us, and it is so much more than I ever expected it would be. And I'll close with the last two paragraphs of the basic text of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, when it says, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find here and join us. We will be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you shall surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. And please remember this, that God does love you, and so do I. Thank you ever so much.